Today's programming is brought to you by NCTV45 and NC Radio 450, Newcastle's community television station.
One of the few buildings we have left that it was built before the Civil War. So this was owned by a family that didn't participate, but all of North Street was lined with homes. It was more of a residential section rather than downtown, so there would have been another number of these homes down through this street. It's called a facade on the front, so it looks new, like it was built in the 40s or 50s. That's not real new, but so it looks like a different building on the front than on the back. This house was owned by Joseph White before the Civil War. We know he never lived in this house, so we suspect that he rented it. In the 1880s, there was a newspaper article about a home in this neighborhood that was two-story brick, and it was the home of an older woman, and she had a trap door in the floor that was outside of the main basement. And in the 1880s, when somebody bought the house and removed one of the rugs, they found that trap door in the floor. Well, I went searching around. I searched all the maps trying to figure out which two-story brick home in a nice neighborhood was that house. Joseph owned this house, but a lady who belonged to his church, Mrs. Semple, and who was involved in the Underground Railroad, she did not own a home here, but we know she lived in this neighborhood. So we think that Mrs. Semple was probably renting from Joseph and was probably right here in this house. And this was probably the house with the trap door. Now I went down, I asked Keith if he'd let me look in his cellar. And it's a very old cellar, the building's been added on to, but there is a place in the floor in that basement where some of the boards have been replaced in the floor. So I'm pretty sure this was one of the homes that was used as part of the underground.
Programming provided through funding from Daimio and Olson Law Group, with offices in Elwood City and in Newcastle in the Washington Center. Daimio and Olson Law Group.
Unfortunately, in Newcastle, most of the Underground Railroad houses are in parking lots. But just to let you know that there was a man that lived right here, to let you know that there were about a dozen people here in the city who participated. Most of the homes are gone because, you know, we build new buildings over time. And most of those original houses were wooden houses. They were replaced with larger brick buildings.
Today's program was furnished by a grant from the Beanery Depot and Deli, featuring coffee, made-to-order subs, and snacks. The Beanery Depot and Deli in Mahoningtown.
All right, I'll let you guys get a closer look at this. This is a photograph taken just before the Civil War, and it's taken of this block right here. So there used to be a two-story wooden store right here where the parking lot is. That was Mr. Clendenin's store. There used to be this huge church. You see that? And that was right there where the Coney Island hot dogs is. There's a little kind of gap in the space there. That church sat right behind Coney Island. And then there was a three-story hotel that was right there where the Penn Power building was. So these are three important places that were in our Underground Railroad stories. Mr. Clendenin was not an abolitionist, which means he didn't really support helping escape slaves, but he had a lot of friends that did. So in this store, Mr. Clendenin had a cellar, and he would allow his friends to hide slaves in that cellar. And when asked about it, he would say, I know nothing, I know nothing. But he'd have this grin on his face, so he was participating without getting into trouble, basically. This church was a Free Presbyterian church. So in the 1840s, a lot of the Presbyterians felt it was not good to have slaves. So they wanted the Presbyterian church, the official church, to say they were against slavery. But the church wouldn't do that. So a number of people that were members of the First Presbyterian Church, so that's the big brown church over there on the corner on Jefferson Street, they said, well, you know, if you're not going to speak out against slavery, we're going to start our own church. So Joseph White was part of that group, and they started the Free Presbyterian Church here in town. And it started out with just 30 members. It eventually became the Central Presbyterian Church. And then later, that church burned in the 1940s, I think, and that later became Northminster Church, which is up on Wilmington Avenue, or out toward the Giant Eagle, out in that area.
Funding for this program furnished by Big Paulie's Sports Bar, Long Avenue, Newcastle.
That was here was Mr. Lewis's inn. And he was kind of a pro-slavery guy. But they had hired a black girl. She was an escaped slave that had come up, and she was working at the inn. And one day, Mr. Lewis was out, but the girl and his daughter Elvira were there working. They were cleaning, so they were the cleaning girls at the inn. And a man had stayed overnight, and he was eating breakfast the next morning, getting ready to leave. Well, that morning, after he was done eating, he grabbed the hold of the black girl's arm and he says, I'm taking you back. I know you're an escaped slave, and he was going to take her back south. Well, she started to scream. So the daughter, who was upstairs sweeping, she heard all that screaming, and she comes running down the stairs, and the only thing she's got is a broom. So she starts beating the guy over the head with the broom, and she starts yelling. Well, there was a neighbor who was coming by in his wagon, so he had his horse and wagon. He heard all the screaming going on in the inn, so he runs in there and sees that the girls are having trouble with this guy, so he knocks him right in the face, knocks him down, and that gave Elvira some time. She got the girl and took her off to hide her out, and the guy with the wagon says, get out of here, get out of town, we don't want you here. So those are three important stories that we have about the Underground Railroad.
Funding provided by Main Street Clothiers and Tailors, Washington Street, Newcastle.
So this is now Brian's hippie shop, and they have gaming in here, and Leanne has her yoga studio. But before the Civil War, the building that was here was the home to Thomas Berry. Thomas was a barber here in town. He moved here in 1854. He was a free black man. We had probably about 100 free blacks here in Newcastle, which meant they were not born to slaves. They were freed probably, you know, when Pennsylvania became a free state. Mary Berry, his wife, she was born in Blairsville to free blacks. We're not sure where they met. We know they lived down near Pittsburgh for a while, and then they eventually moved to Newcastle, where they called him Tom, where Tom set up his barber shop right here in this location. Tom was an important figure, and we'll talk more about him later, but I do have a story about his barber shop. His shop was a hangout, so when the business was slow, the merchants in the area would all come out and hang out at Tom's barber shop and just talk. So one day, Tom was out of the barber shop, and some of the other merchants were there, and an out-of-towner came in, and he was coming in to get a shave. So he came in and he says, you know, this Newcastle, this is a one-horse town. Who would ever live here? This place is crap, you know? You got businesses over there, they'll sell anything from flour to hunting supplies to anything. So in Pittsburgh, where I'm from, we have specialty shops. You know, you can buy hats in one shop and clothes in another, and groceries, you know, we're the big city. Well, these guys got really mad at this guy. So one of them stood up and said, well, you want to shave? He said, yeah. So he got in the chair, and the guy lathered up a bunch of soap and splashed it all over his face, and then he went and sat back down. He said, well, are you going to shave me? He says, oh no, we just lather you up here. You got to go down the street to get the shave. So, even in those days, there was some stuff going on. They had some sense of humor here in Newcastle.
Special thanks to Butts, Flowers, Gifts, and More in downtown Newcastle for their support and funding of this program. Butts Flowers, downtown Newcastle.
Before the Civil War, how did they get around?
Underground Railroad.
Canals.
Oh, you guessed, canals. You're too smart. You
Good
have
job,
to go.
Daddy.
So what, horseback? They had wagons. When they wanted to transport a lot of goods, they used rivers. And in Pennsylvania, they constructed the Pennsylvania Canal so that they could go up rivers that normally would be too shallow to travel on. So they would dig those out so that boats could get through. You're standing right here where a canal went through Newcastle. So it was attached to the Neshannock Creek, and part of the canal came out of right here and went that way over toward the old mall building, over into the Shenango River. There was one across the Neshannock that headed south and went by where all the industry built up. So along where Moravia Street is. So there was a long canal that went there also. And these canals were used to bring goods in. In the 1840s, we had an iron forge that was right here across the river. So if they wanted to bring coal in or iron ore, they could use boats to do that. About 1850 to 60, then the trains started to come in, and trains were easier to get around in, and the trains replaced these canals. But while we still had a canal, so here's a canal boat. We have one photograph of a canal boat from Newcastle, and this has a lot of people standing on it. So they were long boats. They had flat bottoms so that they could travel in fairly shallow waters. One person that traveled through this town on a canal ship was Frederick Douglass. Has anybody heard of Frederick Douglass? So he was an escaped slave. He didn't escape to here. He went up through New England, but after he escaped, he wrote many stories about his experiences as a slave, and then he did public speaking. So Frederick Douglass came through Newcastle twice. Once before the Civil War, he didn't stop, but he just rode the canal boat through here, and he was on his way from Pittsburgh to Youngstown. After the war, he actually stopped here and did a speech, and that was in that church that I showed you. So that Free Presbyterian Church had a big hall in it called White's Hall, and he actually spoke there. So we can say Frederick Douglass floated by here.
A special thank you to Tuscany Square Restaurant, Wilmington and Mitchell Roads, for providing funding for this program.
Remember Thomas Berry, the barber? This is his son, L. Ross Berry. L. Ross Berry became a bricklayer when he was 16 years old. And in 1852, when our courthouse was built, Thomas Berry was the bricklayer for the courthouse. He worked here in Newcastle for several years. He got married, had a couple of children, and he eventually moved to Youngstown, where he not only laid brick, he designed buildings there. So a lot of their administrative buildings, school buildings, that kind of thing, he designed and built. He was so well known in Newcastle that their junior high is named after L. Ross Berry, but he came from Newcastle. The other important thing about the courthouse is that we found a story. It was originally a story about they had arrested some people and confiscated some kegs of beer. And they had to store the beer to use it as evidence.
Today's program was paid for by a grant from Pegley's Pasta and More, East Washington Street in Newcastle.
Under the proprietary's office, and how he probably couldn't stand the fact that there was all that good beer down there. But the one thing they did mention was that the beer was hidden in the part of the cellar where they used to hide slaves escaping on the Underground Railroad. So the courthouse was built in 1852, so this was after that Fugitive Slave Act passed, when it was really illegal to hide anybody. And we thought, well, were they really hiding people there? Well, one of the judges at the time was a big abolitionist. His name was Judge Whippo, and he had all kinds of abolitionist meetings at his houses, and he had access to that courthouse. Another thing, that Free Presbyterian Church, before they built their building, they met up at the courthouse. So all those Free Presbyterian abolitionists had access to the courthouse too. So we think our courthouse was used as part of the underground during that time when it was so illegal for people to be hiding slaves.
A special thanks to the YMCA for caring about the Lawrence County community and providing funding for this program.
John Ewer. John Ewer owned a store. It was more like a hardware store where he sold a lot of equipment, shovels, that kind of thing. When he first moved up here to the Newcastle area, it was when the canal was being built. And he and his brothers sold supplies and equipment to the guys who were working on the canal. And so as they built the canal, they stopped here, and then they followed those men as they worked on the canal all the way up to Youngstown. But John liked the Newcastle area, so when the canal was finished being built, he came back and bought this location. And he built a store here. Now John was part of the underground, and in his obituary it said he hid slaves in his cellars and in his livery stables. We know he had a house that was over by the library, kind of catty corner, just across from the library. He had a house there. He had a store here. This store remained like it was before the Civil War until the 1870s when the store burned. And it was then replaced by this building. But the cellar is the same cellar that was here. We went down and checked on the cellar. There are no secret rooms or anything, but there are some very old nails in walls that kind of dated it to pre-Civil War. So even though the store is not the same building, the cellar here was the location where they were hid while they were traveling north. Mr. Henderson, who had the store next door, also was part of the Underground Railroad. We're not sure if that cellar is still intact, but even that location may still be there. So this is where they hid the slaves on their way through.
This program was provided through funding from Cedars Restaurant in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. A special thanks to Cedars, featuring Middle Eastern, Italian, and American cuisine.
In the city before the Civil War were barbers, and Mr. Stewart was a barber also. And we don't think he helped escaping slaves. But I wanted to show you this picture, because we have a picture of his barber shop. So this little teeny building there, that's Mr. Stewart's barber shop. And the location of that barber shop was right there, where Lanigan's is. Just to give you an idea how much the town has changed since then. Now the Stewart family, we were friends with the Berry family, and some of the Stewarts became bricklayers, and they traveled with the Berries to Youngstown, so they were part of that family.
Today's programming was provided from funding from the Crane Room Grill and Banquet Center, 3009 Wilmington Road. A special thanks to the Crane Room for their participation.
Joseph White's father, Crawford White, was actually one of the first settlers here in this area. He bought a piece of warranty land. So warranty land was given to soldiers who fought in the Civil War. And if they didn't want the land, they could sell it to other people. And Crawford White bought a piece of warranty land that went from Mercer Street all the way over to the river and started at Pizza Hut, went all the way to the top of the hill and then several blocks beyond that. So he owned all that property up there. And he had like a logging mill, he had a farm, he raised beef cattle, then later he had a flour mill. So he was kind of a multi-purpose businessman here. When he died, Joseph White inherited that property. But he didn't live there. He lived in a house down toward the courthouse. But this house was built where Pizza Hut is today. So, and this house was torn down in the 1950s. This was built by the Berry family. So you know Tom and Mary Berry. They never bought that property from Joseph White, but they built the house there. And that house had a trap door in the kitchen or pantry in which to hide slaves. So the Berries were hiding slaves up until probably 1855 or so, when Joseph Thomas had died. Mary was there as a widow, and Joseph White's family moved into the house, and Mary moved into a house down near North Street. So they kind of traded houses. So we're assuming they were good friends because, you know, he let them build a house on the property without buying it. So we think the Berries were one of the few black African-American families that were part of an underground. After the Whites moved there, they continued to be part of the underground. And Joseph tells a few stories. When his dad moved here, he built a log cabin on this side of the road, and then later a brick house, and he planted willow trees there. Joseph talked about when the willow trees, when he lived in the house with the willow trees, there were a couple times when slaves, memorable times. One was a man who came, and because of the chains on his ankle, he had a big scar, a big indentation on his ankle from the chain that he had worn as a slave. The other black that came through here actually worked on a ship, and we get more information, we find that a lot of blacks were shipmates. And he worked on a sailing ship and escaped and came up through here. Later on, after they were in the Pizza Hut house, there was a whole wagon load of slaves that came into town, and everybody was worried because that was a lot of people to hide, and of course it was against the law by then. So Joseph said, I'm not worried. Adelaide's a great cook, we'll welcome them in, and they kept a lot of those slaves in their house overnight. And the next evening, and it was in November and there was snow on the ground, he borrowed a lightweight wagon and they walked up the North Hill. The men stayed outside of the wagon and the ladies rode inside, and the men walked up beside the wagon till they got to the top, and then they climbed aboard. And they took them to the next location, which was up in Mercer County. Farmer John Young was a farmer up there, and he and a couple other guys had farms up there where they took in slaves. And then from there, they would go up to Erie, and they would cross Lake Erie to get to Canada, where they would be free. So, slaves that came here to Newcastle usually came from the Pittsburgh area. They would either come here and go on over to Youngstown and up to Lake Erie, or they'd go directly north and up to Lake Erie.
There's more than meets the eye. You gotta give them a Newcastle a try. The right small town for living. Look around.